this video, I want to conclude the series that we started off with Moten and Harney on the worker strike resolution. In the last video, we kind of got to talk a little bit about like what Moten and Harney look like on the affirmative, and in some of the other videos, we got to look at like what Moten and Harney would look like as a negative strategy and how policy teams can best answer it. I think that for this particular video, I want to talk a little bit more about like how teams can answer the Moten and Harney arguments when they're on the perspective of the affirmative, how negative teams can better build response to these affirmatives, because I definitely think that this has been a source of argumentation that K teams have been going to a lot more recently. I definitely see a lot more multi-preservation arguments. I definitely see more arguments about like the undercommons and logistics and other stuff, and so I definitely think that this is another resolution where that would be like a really prominent argument and something that we should definitely talk about, because I definitely think that if you can build a set of nuanced responses to it, it can be like just one of those stock things that you really could like use at a tournament against like multiple teams or a school, and it's definitely something that I think could be really useful in terms of building just a set of responses to anti-blackness outside of the normative frame of like how people would usually respond to pessimism, which I think is important for kind of like moving the conversations forward in terms of like how they become more nuanced and detailed and textured by like the various types of argumentation that you can kind of bring in, even if it means still like using some of the kind of like older responses and blending them with different types of delivery for like how you're texturing it for this particular resolution and this particular debate. And so the first thing that I kind of want to talk about are just like what are the main things that I think are priorities to really keep a hold of when you're debating against these teams that are reading affirmatives like this. I definitely think that having a strong line of argumentation about the kind of like lack of a structural theory is definitely something that you want to take up. I think that you need to be extremely prepared for a permutation debate no matter what strategy you're reading, because I feel like a lot of teams really pull off really strong Moten and Harney arguments when they're able to really make their form of like changing the way in which we create resistance and how resistance is kind of like socialized as an apparatus that can be taken up by like most alternatives and most differential kind of like leftist ways of thinking about the uses of debate and our relationships to the state, etc. And so oftentimes I feel like a lot of teams are put in pinches between the permutation and just being able to only defend refusal, the status quo, or like something that feels like just a complete impact turn to the affirmative. And I definitely think that being able to just have heavy answers to whatever type of like permutation type arguments are available on whatever floor you're going for is extremely important to being able to just like hammer back in some of the main weapons of this affirmative altogether. I think that additionally, one of the things that is really, really helpful for being able to build strong arguments against Moten and Harney affirmatives, no matter what place you're coming from, is to think about the kind of like relationship that you want to take in terms of like the utility of the law and not just the law in terms of like individual policies, but like what is the kind of like what is the value of institutionality and what is the ability for Moten to escape institutionality. I think that there are definitely two ways to go on this. I think you can invest hard, whether it's at like the state or just like vertical organizing, or whether it's just arguments about just like the possibility of like reform in general, the kind of like idea that just like there is an inevitability to institutions, there's inevitability to like our need to navigate them, and so the ability to kind of like talk through the important parts of the 1AC requires to recognize the experience that happens when these movements inevitably come in contact with the state and what that kind of like looks like in terms of the resolution for what tactics are formed in the face of that. And then I think additionally there's also a lot of those kind of like sidestep that question that are just kind of like our argument is anti-institutionality, but then how do you build a different way of organizing that doesn't require like a kind of like focus on individualism or you to be kind of like pinned down to individualism, because I definitely think a lot of the offense there is something that is really good when applied extremely well, but isn't applied to like every alternative as I think it has to be. And I definitely think there is a utility for just a differential way of thinking about like how you can contest these affirmatives on multiple levels, regardless of whether or not they're strictly talking about the academy or strictly talking about the state or whatever. When I'm generally thinking about like how you should really be handling the case debate against some of these affirmatives, I think some of the strongest case arguments are really just how can you set up a lot of the particular barriers between like the theory that you'll be pushing on the majority of what you think the 2NR could be in relationship to like the specific capabilities of the affirmative to be able to access that. I definitely think the case page is a place not where you can like build up a lot of like permutation answers proper, but where you can kind of like hinge at the inability of the and force the kind of like affirmative to really like choose sides on a lot of questions, whether it be choosing sides on the role of like what on the role that like reform plays in the way that we think about resistance, or whether or not it's choosing sides in relationship to like how they kind of like stand on the relationship that blackness has to things like questions of ontology or the way it relates to just like anti-black flatness as a structural question and slavery as this kind of like structure, I think are all like good places for you to kind of like push and get really good questions on like how the affirmative is staking itself by making arguments about like the ability of liberalism to be able to self-reflect and reform itself in a way that resolves the affirmative better than the AF method does, on being able to win that the examples that the affirmative is citing don't really spill up to resolve the material impacts in the same way that they think they do. And trying to do that really specific work on the affirmative can make it a lot easier for you to really set out arguments regardless of what kind of like off-case position you want to go for. And I think when we start applying like what this advice looks like in terms of a framework and T-debate, I really think that the value of being able to beat these arguments, I think, is really at the procedural level. I definitely think that the affirmatives have a much easier time dealing with questions of like what the pedagogical value of the process of doing the affirmative, and the affirmative is like a form of debating. But I think that the negative has like a little bit more stance in terms of like why, if a good impact comparison debate is done, the kind of procedural terms aren't really able to be touched and kept stable by the affirmative's interpretation. I definitely think that's like much more on the question of like how you are able to build like what the standard for proving that is, and how you're able to make your arguments as you go throughout the debate, if you're going for framework and T, more adaptive to how the affirmative is kind of staking its claims. But I definitely think that there are good arguments to be made about the contradictions between like whatever interpretation the affirmative is offering and their ability to decide what type of limits are good and bad, what type of arguments are and are not relevant to the type of studies that we should do under the resolution, and how they don't kind of like copy the same type of like policing or the types of like tactics that attempt to like limit and create boundaries around like what is accessible in terms of like how we discuss the resolution. And I think that being able to win that ultimately allows the risk of them to be tied back to their offense, makes it a lot more plausible for you to win that the way that you're considering a lot of the kind of like more procedural values of the debate are core to the functioning and maintenance of like how they think they're getting access to those educational benefits, which I think is a good place to kind of like stake a combo of like your offense and defense for you to have a really good balance with some of the case arguments that we mentioned before. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully it'll be even better when you go into the final video that I'll be doing talking about Moten and the worker strike. And yeah, thanks as always for watching.